Hey everybody, we are going to do a lab today on neurons and spinal cords. So this is a model of a multipolar motor neuron. All right, it's multipolar because I see it has multiple processes coming off my cell body here. Of course, my cell body, outlined in blue, is known as my soma. I see my nucleus and my nissal body, which is my rough ER, in it. I got multiple dendrites coming off of it. Of course, the dendrites and the soma, they are the receptive region of my neuron. They're going to get synapses from other neurons and get information transfer in that way. Now I've got a single solitary axon here, starting right here and extending onward, and it's been cut off, so we can't see it entirely. Now we've zoomed in on the soma, or the cell body, just to show you that nucleus and that nissal body. Remember that the nissal body, or nissal substance, is the rough ER, the rough endoplasmic reticulum of the neuron. Now we see a bunch of dendrites coming out. Of course, the word dendrite means branches, and dendrites do branch extensively, which give me more surface area, which creates a bigger receptive region for the neuron. So what I also see here, which is really important, is I see telodendria. So these little brown guys here and here and here, these are telodendria. Telodendria are branches at the end of an axon. So these are branches from the axons of other neurons. Okay? Telo means end, dendria means branches. So these are branches at the ends of axons of other neurons, and every telodendrion is going to end in an axon terminal. And that axon terminal is synapsing with a dendrite in this case, or synapsing with a cell body in this case. Note that this axon terminal is cut in section to show you that it is filled with vesicles, synaptic vesicles, that would contain neurotransmitters. Now, what I've got here is the initial part of my axon hillock. This is my initiation zone as well. This is where I will begin action potential formation. So now I've gone away from the soma. The soma will be off to your left over here, and I'm zooming in, or looking at least, the axon and its coverings. Now, the naked axon, of course, has a cell membrane to it, and that cell membrane of the axon is called the axolemma. So anytime you can see the axon itself, we see its cell membrane, which is the axolemma. Now, this axon in particular that we have here is a myelinated axon, and I see 1, 2, 3 Schwann cells, or neurolemmacytes, whose plasma membranes are wrapping around the axon, creating this insulating layer called the myelin sheath. So this is one Schwann cell right here. These are the many layers of its plasma membrane as it is wrapped around the axon, and I see its nucleus right there as well. Now, if we zoom in on a Schwann cell here and another Schwann cell here, there is a gap between them. The gap between a pair of Schwann cells, or a pair of neurolemmacytes, is called a node of Ranvier. And we know the presence of the nodes of Ranvier would allow for action potential to proceed via saltatory conduction, which we talked about in lecture. The outer surface of the plasma membrane of the neurolemmacyte is called the neuralemma. Lemma means husk or covering, so the covering of the axon is the axolemma, and the covering of the neurolemmacyte is the neuralemma. Now, what we also see here is the layer of loose connective tissue that wraps around the Schwann cell and that layer of loose connective tissue is called the endoneurium. And so axons are not by themselves. They are always bundled together into nerves in your PNS or into tracts in your CNS. And when we bundle axons together, we have to have a means to attach them to their neighbors, and that is done by the endoneurium. Okay, and with that, folks, we are done with the motor neuron model, and we're moving on to the big model of the spinal cord. So we do see the spinal cord starting right here, coming out of the brainstem, going all the way down, spinal cord then ending right there. So running from the foramen magnum up here and coming down all the way down, ending at L1. Now my spinal cord, I also see multiple nerves emanating from it. So lots of nerves coming out of it. And oftentimes the nerves will branch and reconnect into these networks called plexuses. So I see a plexus here and here and here. And we'll go over those plexuses later. We'll name a few nerves as well. I do see in the front of my spinal cord here, this line, this is called the anterior median fissure. I can also note that my spinal cord is going to have cervical region, thoracic region, lumbar region, sacral region, and even a little coccygeal region. Okay, let's zoom in. So I've zoomed in on my cervical spinal cord. I see the medulla oblongata above it, and the pons above that. I see its trigeminal nerves right there, of course. And here is my cervical spinal cord right here, just inferior to that brainstem. Now I want you to notice that there is a slightly thicker portion of the cervical spinal called the cervical enlargement. This is where I have a lot of neurons going to and coming from my upper limbs. So think about the degree of muscular movement, the dexterity, the degree of sensation we have in our upper limbs. All that movement, all that sensation requires copious neurons. So I'm going to have a thicker region of my spinal cord to accommodate those neurons. All right. I also see one of those groups of nerves up here, one of those nets of nerves. This is called the cervical plexus. Spinal nerves C1 to C4 make up my cervical plexus. Coming off that cervical plexus, and I see it only on the right here, is the phrenic nerve. So I see the phrenic nerve right here. The word phrenic refers to the diaphragm, and in fact that is where this nerve is going. It takes motor signals to the diaphragm, which of course is the major muscle of inspiration. Another net of nerve fibers right here. This is my brachial plexus. So C5 to T1 forms this brachial plexus. Nerves in here, like the name brachial suggests, are going to go to the arms. So we're going to have things like an axillary nerve, radial nerve, ulnar nerve, and more emanating from this guy. So that pretty much takes care of the cervical cord for us. If we go down a bit, we can see the thoracic cord. And I see lots of intercostal nerves coming in between the ribs there. And again, there's my brachial plexus, there's my cervical plexus, there's my phrenic nerve. And my cervical enlargement, there's the wide region right there. So there's the thoracic cord. Let's not stop there. Let's check out the other three regions of the cord, the lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal regions. So even though the cord ends at L1, there are still lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal regions to it. Notice that we have a thickening here as well. This is the lumbosacral enlargement. So we had a cervical enlargement to accommodate the many neurons for our upper limb. Similarly, we're going to have a lumbosacral enlargement to accommodate the many neurons for our lower limbs. I also want you to see that the spinal cord is getting narrow. Let me back up for a second so you can see it better without my red lines on it. But notice that the cord is getting narrow as we come to the end. That narrowing of the cord is called the conus medullaris. So the cord is tapering and coming to a point, sort of, and that tapering area is the conus medullaris. Attached to the conus medullaris, you see this line right here? This line, this one structure in the middle of all these things. This is a string of pia mater, and this string of pia mater is called the phylum terminale, the string at the end, and is going to come down and anchor the spinal cord to the posterior coccyx. Now that phylum terminale is in the middle of a whole collection of spinal nerves. Because the spinal cord ends at L1, a lot of nerves have to go down before they go out, and so we get a vertical collection of spinal nerves, and that vertical collection of spinal nerves is called the cauda equina. Somebody thought it resembled the tail of a horse, so that's what cauda equina is going to mean. Now, I do also see another big net of nerve fibers. This big net of nerve fibers is my lumbosacral plexus. So we had 3 plexuses that we saw today. This one's L1 to S4. And my lumbosacral plexus is going to give off some nerves, including an obturator nerve, the skinny one right here, which is going to come down, go through that obturator foramen, and end up in the medial thigh. Notice the obturator nerve is nice and skinny right here. We also have a much thicker nerve called the sciatic nerve, which basically goes to the back of the thigh, the leg, and the bottom of the foot. So as the sciatic, the thick one, and then the skinny one is the obturator. And with that, we are done with that big spinal cord model. So we are switching things up to a cross section of the cord. And this is a cervical spinal cord, which I know because I see it's a cervical vertebra with its vertebral transverse foramina here, its flattish superior articular facets, its bifid spinous process. Now let's start with the coverings around the cord. We do see some fat here. This is fat in the epidural space, and just within that fat, my first meninx is my dura mater, as my spinal dura mater. Recall that the brain had 2 layers to its cranial dura mater, a periosteal and a meningeal layer, but the spinal cord only has a single one. If I go deep to that dura mater, the next layer here is the arachnoid mater. Now, the model doesn't show me the crisscrossing of fibers that gives my arachnoid mater its cobwebby appearance and accounts for the name arachnoid, which means spider. By the way, of course, dura means strong and tough, like as in the word durable. Finally, I got my pia mater. Not finally, I almost forgot. We got under the arachnoid mater is the subarachnoid space, which is all right here. This space would be occupied by cerebrospinal fluid, which came out of the 4th ventricle. Recall the 4th ventricle has a trio of apertures, of openings that are connecting with the subarachnoid space. And then finally, we got our pia mater. The pia mater is directly on the spinal cord. It goes in with the fissure, comes back out, directly on the spinal cord. By the way, the mater means mother. So we have a gentle mother, spider mother, and tough mother. Those are our 3 wrappings. Okay, I do see a slight line here. This is my posterior median sulcus in the back. And I want you to notice also that my spinal cord has gray matter that is sort of in the shape of a butterfly, surrounded by white matter. The white matter is going to contain columns of myelinated axons. A column is known as a funiculus, and in the back of the cord we would find posterior funiculi, which are primarily taking sensory information up to your brain. On the side of the white matter, we've got lateral funiculi, taking a combo of sensory signals up as well as motor commands down. And so if we have posterior and lateral funiculi, no surprise, we are also going to have anterior funiculi. Anterior funiculi primarily taking motor commands up. Got some sensory ones coming down as well. That takes care of my white matter. I've got an anterior median fissure here as well. Remember, a fissure is deep, a sulcus is shallow. Now let's do some gray matter. In the gray matter, we see a projection here. This is known as a ventral horn. The ventral horn contains somatic motor neuron cell bodies. Somatic motor neurons are going to skeletal muscles. That's what the word somatic tells me. On the other side, I've got my dorsal horn. In my dorsal horn, I have axons coming in. They are sensory axons. Remember, of course, this class, it makes you feel sad, especially this part of the spinal cord. Spinal cord makes you feel sad. That's my mnemonic device. I know my sensory neurons are going to be afferent, meaning they're going to the spinal cord, and my sensory neurons are coming in dorsally. Okay, so sensory neurons coming into my dorsal horn, somatic motor neurons coming out. Now, connecting the right and left halves of the gray matter, connecting like the two wings of the butterfly, is the body of the butterfly here, which is called the gray commissure. And my gray commissure has a passageway in the middle called the central canal, which will have CSF in it and is continuous with my fourth ventricle. Now, what I'm looking at here is a root. A root is a bundle of axons. This is the dorsal root. So this is a bundle of axons that are going in, taking information in to the dorsal horn. So my dorsal root is a bundle of axons taking sensory information into my dorsal horn. Now, about those axons, those dorsal root axons, well, structurally, what kind of axons are they? They are unipolar axons. So unipolar axons have their cell body, kind of like along, unipolar neurons rather, have their cell body along the way. So this purple line here is the axon of my sensory neuron, and this little guy that I drew here, this circularish thing, that is the cell body. So unipolar neurons have their cell bodies alongside their axon, as opposed to a motor neuron. A motor neuron would have its cell body right here, and then the axons coming out like that. So because the cell body is along the axon, there is going to be a region where there are many such cell bodies, and it's going to be a thicker region because the cell bodies are big, and that thickening is in the dorsal root, and it is called the dorsal root ganglion. Recall that a ganglion is a peripheral collection of cell bodies. Okay, fantastic. Not only is there a dorsal root, but there is a ventral root. The ventral root is taking information, motor commands out. So motor neurons are starting in the ventral horn. There's my cell body of my motor neuron in the ventral horn, and then coming out, traveling via the ventral root and onward, going eventually to a skeletal muscle. Notice there is no ventral root ganglion because the cell bodies are in the ventral horn. Okay. Once the dorsal and ventral roots have combined, we then have a spinal nerve. Now the dorsal root was sensory and the ventral root was motor. Since the spinal nerve is a combination of those two, the spinal nerve is a mixed nerve, meaning it carries both motor and sensory signals. You met some mixed nerves in the cranial nerve discussion. So nerves like the facial or the trigeminal, glossopharyngeal nerves, vagus nerves, those are all mixed nerves. And now we're done with that cervical spinal cord, and we have another pair of models here that are also cross-sectional views of the spinal cord. And we're not going to really see too much new stuff. We're just going to see a couple new things. I do still see my posterior median sulcus and my anterior median fissure. I do see my funiculus in the back and in the side and in the front. I'm not going to discuss these functions again because we already did that. And I see my ventral horn, but now I see something new. These models depict a lateral horn, which is only found in the thoracic and upper lumbar parts of the spinal cord. Lateral horns are motor, but they're autonomic motor. That means they're not going to skeletal muscle. Instead, they're going to involuntary things like smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. So notice the lateral horns on these models that we did not see on the cervical one. All right, I see my dorsal horn. I see my gray commissure. I see my central canal. I see my dorsal root. I see my dorsal root ganglia. I really like the ganglia on these models. They're just nice and easy to see, especially this one. And there's my ventral root. And then once my ventral and my dorsal root combines, I get a spinal nerve. Now on the bottom part of on this lower model, the only one I've got in this picture now, I do see some branches or rami of my spinal nerve. So I do see a posterior and an anterior ramus. And now I've got a microscopic view of the spinal cord. I'm not going to show you anything new here. There's nothing new. It's all stuff we've met already, like the anterior median fissure, like an anterior funiculus, and of course a lateral, and of course a posterior funiculus as well. And again, I see my horns, ventral and dorsal horn, no lateral horn in this particular slice just because we're not in the right region. But I do see my gray commissure connecting the left and right sides, as well as a lovely central canal. All right, now what I want to do is I want to zoom in on the ventral horn. And I've zoomed in on the ventral horn. Just as a reminder, this is the ventral horn right here. And I'm zooming in on the ventral horn, and I see a trio of multipolar motor neurons, as well as lots of nuclei from glial cells. I can see my cell body of my motor neuron here. I do see its nucleus, and then the nissl body is around it. There's my nucleus. There's a nice dendrite, of course, part of the receptive region of the neuron. And there's a glial cell right there. And now, actually, let me go backwards for a second here. Let me go way back, way back, way back, way back. There it is. Remember the dorsal root had axons, sensory axons going into the dorsal horn? And because those were unipolar neurons, we had the cell bodies clustered together right here in the dorsal root ganglion. What I want to do now is zoom in on that dorsal root ganglion, and here I've done so. These round guys here, these are my somata of my sensory, I don't want to do green, of my sensory neurons. So remember, a sensory neuron is a unipolar neuron, meaning it'll have some dendrites that fuse together to create the axon. Then the axon will travel until it ends. But along the way, we encounter the cell body. And that cell body is what we're looking at here. And we see these cell bodies clustered together in that dorsal root ganglion. All right, good stuff, good stuff. We're almost done. Last slide. I see a whole bunch of glial cells. Like, this is a nucleus of a glial cell. And of course, I see many, many, many more. All right, my friends, that is it for lab number 19. Spinal cord, nerves, neurons, all that good stuff. So I'll see you next time. What are we talking about next time? We are talking about reflexes. All right, bye.